All right, class, I wanted to give a brief lecture today about connecting George Orwell and his novel 1984 to the real world. Your essay on 1984 is asking you to argue whether or not Mr. Orwell was accurate or correct. Correct may not be the right word, but if his vision of the future was accurate or if it was worthwhile or not. And, as I said on the prompt and in the video, you can argue that he was not correct. I don't want you to think that I'm Mr. Orwell, Team Orwell, and you have to argue that he was correct. You can say that he was wrong, and there are things that he was wrong about. So I wanted to go over a couple of pointers. I don't really want to spoon feed you this stuff, but I do want you to be aware, at least, of some things that are Orwellian that apply to the real world, and maybe that don't apply, and maybe that kind of use Orwellian themes or trends, but that ultimately go a little bit further than Orwell did. So I have it broken down into three categories: Orwellian trends, beyond Orwell, and did Orwell get it wrong or Orwell got it wrong. So we'll just go through this list. The first one is domestic surveillance. So you recall in 1984, the entirety of the population is watched all of the time from the telescreens on the wall, which are basically two ways. They project propaganda and commands from various party members, and they record. They record sounds and video, which is then sent to some nameless place where they view all this material. And the idea is that you're constantly being watched. So at the time that this came out, that this book was written, it was in the 40s, the late 40s. I want to say it was 48 or 49 that he finished writing it. And during that time, we didn't really have domestic surveillance of everyday people like we do today. And part of the issue is that the technology didn't really exist, which is a huge part of it. But also the need, the sort of the social need for it, or the argument that it was needed, was not as strong. So the domestic surveillance in the United States, this may come as a shock to you. I really doubt it at this point, but it used to come as a shock to my students. Your metadata, who you call, when you call them, from where you call them, is all compiled by the government. It's kept in the NSA database, and all of that information is collected and sort of used by that agency to supposedly catch terror suspects. So all of this kind of started after 9/11. You had the passing of the Patriot Act, which essentially removed Fourth Amendment protections from people who were suspected of terror in some way or another, or who had possible affiliations with terror groups or extremist groups or things like that. And so the way that is worded, obviously, many people would say, well, why should we worry about the rights of potential terrorists? And that's a fair point. But what we found with the revelations of a guy named Edward Snowden, who some of my students in the past have argued as a traitor, some has argued as a sort of a civil libertarian and a hero, and whatever you think about him, the stuff that he showed regarding the NSA, or the National Security Agency, which he revealed during the Obama administration, the information was leaked that the government was spying on pretty much all Americans, regardless of your affiliation with terrorism. And the justification for this was based on the system of hops, meaning that, so a hop is, imagine you have your cell phone, right? And in your cell phone, there are, let's say you're fairly popular, so you got 300 contacts. I don't know, is that fairly popular? So you got 300 contacts. That's one hop. Every person in your contact book is one hop. Now, two hops away is every person in the contact book of every person that's in your contact book. Okay, your contacts list. So that's two hops. Three hops is every person that's in there. You get the picture, right? It compounds. So the law was written that a terror suspect or that someone who qualifies for surveillance in this way and the removal of Fourth Amendment protections is any person that is three hops or less away from someone who is on a watch list. Now, if you start to do the math, by the time you get to the third hop for most people, you're dealing with millions of people, right? So basically, the way the law was written, it allowed for the surveillance of pretty much every American citizen based on this ridiculous hop system, right? So Edward Snowden was a data analyst. He worked for the CIA, but he worked at the NSA, which is the National Security Agency. He saw this stuff going on. He saw that they were gathering this information on everyday American citizens. And he said, wait a minute, that's not constitutional. And he went to the top brass at the NSA and tried to use the built-in whistleblower systems, and they didn't work. And so he made the decision to leak the information on what's called the PRISM program, PRISM. It's an acronym. I can't remember what it stands for. To a newspaper called The Guardian, specifically a journalist known as Glenn Greenwald, who at the time worked for The Guardian. Glenn Greenwald then redacted all information from that could possibly hurt people. For example, people's addresses and stuff. You don't want to dox government agents, things like that. And once the harmful information was redacted, Glenn Greenwald published the information in The Guardian, and it was a big deal because prior to that, the government had essentially lied and said that it wasn't spying on ordinary Americans. So to have the revelation that it was in fact doing so was pretty striking. Since then, they claim to have scaled back the NSA surveillance, which I hope is true, but nevertheless, it remains a sort of stain on the civil liberties issue here in the United States. It is also not the only way that you are being spied on. It's not just the government, right? It's not just Big Brother. It's also the social media companies themselves, right? The search engines and all of the stuff that you use keep records of what you're doing, of your metadata, of your activity online, of what you're interested in and what kind of things that you gravitate towards. And then that's kind of used to really customize your internet experience, but also to build sort of a profile on who you are and what you like and how you might respond to external stimuli. And so that's done by the companies that you willingly subscribe to. It's also done by foreign governments, not just our own. There's also the degree to which you spy on each other, right? I know that you've probably spied on a few people on the internet before. Maybe not. Maybe you're a saint, and that's good. But I would imagine that it does happen. I've had several students, particularly students that are dual enrollment, tell me about an app called Life 360 that their parents use to spy on them, which I try to imagine what 14-year-old me would do to avoid the surveillance. Maybe pay some guy to go to the library and keep your phone for a while or whatever. But nevertheless, it's a weird time to be alive from the perspective of domestic surveillance because everyone is spying on everyone all the time. You're also the most recorded group of people in history because when you go to any random store, any gas station, a Walmart, the town square, hell, they even have trail cams in the woods now. Literally everywhere you go, you are being recorded. There's some kind of documentation. So that's a really very Orwellian theme, and it's one that's actually almost worse than Orwell predicted it because one of the things that he predicted was that this would all be done by telescreen. He never imagined that you would be carrying the telescreen around in your hand, right? A supercomputer, a smartphone, which has GPS location and all this other stuff, microphones, cameras. So yeah, I think that's probably if to use that term, low hanging fruit, that's probably the most obvious Orwellian thing that's happening today. It's domestic surveillance. The next thing is going to be perpetual war. If you recall in the novel, war is perpetual, it's ongoing, and it's done on purpose, by design, for the purpose of creating scarcity. Now, that's the part where I get a little iffy, and we'll talk about that in a minute, creating scarcity. I don't know if that's really the intended goal, but in my own lifetime, it's hard for me to think of a time when the United States was not involved in some kind of serious conflict. Um, there probably are a few periods of time of general peace, but pretty much the entire time I've been alive, there has been some sort of military operation going on. So you have to wonder, is that related to Orwell's view of a perpetual war? Is this part of that whole paradigm, or is this just something necessary that had to be done, and maybe the future will be more peaceful? Who knows? The next one is going to be doublespeak. A lot of the Orwellian terms, double think is the one that's hard to pin down because that's the one where people share contradicting opinions simultaneously. But double speak is basically just the use of euphemisms in a political context or a propaganda context. So, a euphemism is a term that we use to make something seem better than what it is. So, if you say, "Oh, or we're gonna fire half of this department," right? Well, the word fire, right, in addition to having the connotations of fire, which is hot and dangerous, it is kind of a word that if you get fired, there's no way to escape the negative connotation of that word, right? So you'll see examples of doublespeak or euphemism would be, "Oh, no, 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 we're not firing, we're downsizing," right? We're managing our human resources department or something, using some sort of mealy mouthed doublespeak term to disguise the severity or the true intention of what it is that you are um, saying, right? So I do have some examples of real world doublespeak. Let me make sure that okay, I'm going to share this tab. Cool. So this was something that happened a few years ago. I can't remember the exact date. It was during the first Trump administration, and this is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He was the head of ISIS, the Islamic State, and he was killed in a military operation, special forces, and he was killed, and so this was considered a triumph for the administration at the time, in the same way that killing Osama bin Laden was a triumph for Obama. Now, the weird thing is that the Washington Post ran an article referring to which they eventually pulled. They pulled it after like a day or two because they were like, "Wait, what? How did this happen?" But you can read the article title here: Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, austere religious scholar at helm of Islamic State, dies at 48. Now that terminology, austere religious scholar, okay, that's a very interesting way to describe the leader of what is essentially a terrorist organization, right? Austere, if someone is austere, it means they go through trials and tribulations or difficulties which sort of improve their character or constitute their character, okay? Religious, we know that word. Scholar, we also know that word because you're going to college. I hope you know scholar. So those are not terms that you would use. Those are terms that are meant, it's a euphemism. It's a way to make him seem less bad than he was. And you have to wonder why. Now, one thing I don't know, obviously, in order to really know, you'd have to be like a fly on the wall at the Washington Post and maybe over the desk of the guy who wrote it and see what he was thinking. But I would probably suggest that it had something to do with maybe taking the wind out of the sails of the particular presidential candidate that was overseeing this particular operation. That's a theory. It's not to say that it's not to be sort of partisan or weigh in on which of these sides is desirable or whatever. It's just to say that because of the opposing agendas of the Washington Post and their political opponents, I think it's possible that this was done as a means of trying to take the wind out of the sails, proverbially. Again, don't have a dog in that fight. Just suggesting it generally, because I can't think of another reason. I mean, if you can think of a better one, I'd love to hear it. But that's a very strange use of terminology. And the Washington Post, which is owned by, at the time, I don't know if it still is. I'm pretty sure it is. Was owned by Jeff Bezos, who was CEO of Amazon and didn't really care for the administration at the time. So there is a conflict there that could explain it. Regardless of the explanation, it is very weird. It is very weird that terminology would be used. And it's definitely Orwellian. In the novel, doublespeak is used all the time to make things that are lousy seem good, right? And here you go. We found one. Just to be a little even-handed, let's look at this one. This is from the 80s. Okay, so it's a little less problematic because, we didn't really know how the story was going to play out. But here you can see this article title here, Anti-Soviet Warrior Puts His Army on the Road to Peace. Okay, that's a very loaded headline. But if you look at the image of the individual, this is Osama bin Laden. And this article was written in the 80s when Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen were basically fighting a proxy war against the Soviet Union. The United States provided them with aid and training and things like that to help them in this proxy war. Then once the Soviet Union collapsed and left Afghanistan, the anti-Soviet warrior turned his ire on the United States for a number of different reasons. But it goes to show you the nature of propaganda and the nature of political propaganda and how you can use words and euphemisms and doublespeak to spin a yarn and to make things seem better than they actually are. Again, this particular headline was done prior to 9/11, so nobody really could have known. But it's not difficult to foresee that maybe something bad could have happened. I mean, that's kind of the nature of those sorts of conflicts. All right, so we have doublespeak. That's cool. Moving on to the next one. The propaganda and the news media. The concept of the news media and the free press in the United States is based on the concept of what we call the fourth estate or the watchdog. So the idea was that if you had a free press, a press that was not afraid to report on the powerful, then you would have a check and balance mechanism in place to keep the powerful accountable. In other words, if you're going to do something sketchy or malicious or whatever, if there's a free press there that's watching what you're doing and telling people what you're doing, that becomes an issue, and it becomes something that perhaps checks you and keeps you from doing very corrupt or nefarious things. We have seen in the past few political cycles in the United States, we have seen the media come under a lot of scrutiny, a lot of people claiming that there are innate biases towards this or that party or this or that group or whatever. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think also sometimes that accusation of being fake news or misinformation gets thrown around unfairly. But I think by and large, we do have a kind of problem with either the news media being loyal to the status quo or the news media circulating false or misleading information. Again, it depends on the situation. It depends on the group. It's not to say that independent media is really any better. I think anyone is capable of this kind of thing. But we definitely see in the form of the Espionage Act, which was passed during the First World War, You saw during the kind of the latter part of the second Bush administration, and then during the Obama administration and onward, you saw the use of this Espionage Act, basically, which says that if you leak classified information to a third party, you can be charged under this act for espionage, and it doesn't really matter the context whereby you leaked the information. So the law itself was designed to prevent, uh, traitorous behavior during wartime. But then you had these more modern political affiliations sort of dust this law off. Hey, this is still on the books. We can use this to prosecute journalists that leak information on us. And that has happened. People who are doing journalism, which is basically someone gives you information, you publish that information to the public, right? Have been charged under the Espionage Act. Primary, the primary penalty of which could even be death, depending on how severe it is. It's written into the law that you can get up to death for espionage. Now, what is the difference between news reporting and espionage? Well, it's who you give the information to and how hurtful the information is overall. So in the case of the news media, who do you give the information to? You give the information to the public, the American public. Now, the idea is that they need to stay informed so that democracy can function. Because if you do not know what the powerful are doing, how can you hope to vote to affect their behavior? You can't. Now, that's a very different thing from, let's say, taking classified information and giving it to a foreign power, giving it to a foreign government, right? So there is a sort of a disconnect here, wherein we're kind of crossing the boundary that is intended to protect the free press by using this law to prosecute these people. This is one of the things that Edward Snowden is afraid of. He's afraid of returning to the United States because if he does, he'll get charged under the Espionage Act. This is also something that the founder of WikiLeaks, whose name is Julian Assange, is likely to be charged under, provided he does not die in prison. And it is a similar situation. He published information to the public that was given to him by an unknown source, and apparently that is enough to make him a criminal. I'm not going to really lead you towards any conclusion regarding any of that. I think you should check it out for yourself. But it is an interesting situation where we're having this sort of conflation between propaganda and news media and the free press and the fourth estate. Is this really a thing? You think about Winston's job working for the Ministry of Truth. He basically makes up stories on behalf of the party to serve the party, right? That's the definition of fake news, right? So I do think you could use a lot of that kind of stuff. I would say if you're going to do the news media thing, be very careful about your own biases. I think that sometimes we just kind of knee jerk and assume that anything published that goes against our preconceived notions or preconceived beliefs must be fake news. That's not how it works. You have to be able to prove that it's actually fake for whatever reason, right? And you do that through corroboration and through the acquisition of factual information, which is easier said than done. If you want to look into the WikiLeaks problem, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that because it's a very loaded and controversial, politicized topic, but that may be a good place to look in to really get the nuts and bolts of this issue. Number 5 is newspeak, right? You recall in the novel, they shortened language for the purpose of kind of making everybody dumber and preventing revolution from happening. And this was imposed by the government. So no, the government isn't going around telling us to use a new language that's more condensed. But funnily enough, we are kind of newspeaking ourselves. Because think about, text messages and text speak and the abbreviated terminology that we use to communicate. Also, I'm pretty sure everyone listening to this video has experienced some kind of problem in communication that results from the abbreviation of language or language not being used to the extent of its sophistication and of its communicative ability, and that causing you problems. But we do this, it's sort of self-imposed. We do it for the purpose of convenience. And I think that's interesting how it's coming about, but it's coming about in a different way, right? The next one, the six, is the culture of violence. So if you recall, especially in the first part of chapter one in the first book of the novel, Winston goes to a movie theater and watches a movie. And the movie is just gratuitous violence being enacted by military targets upon innocent civilians. And everyone in the theater is just really roused up over this and excited and cheering and jumping up and down. And, we see later Winston kind of has violent tendencies, at least in his mind. He has violent thoughts. We see that violence is an inextricable part of the society. And it seems to be that Orwell is implying that an increase in violent media leads to an increase in violent behavior, that the one begets the other. Now, I love to bring this up in a seated class in particular, because you always get the people who are really into video games, right? You know who you are, you're out there. And generally speaking, those people will die on the hill that violent media does not promote violence, because they've heard that their entire lives. People are suggesting, you play these first-person shooters, you play Grand Theft Auto, whatever, this is going to corrupt you, it's going to make you into some kind of violent person. Is that right or not? That's an interesting question. We definitely have a general attitude of tolerance towards violence, especially compared to other Western countries. Countries in Europe tend to be violence is very taboo, whereas sexuality generally is less taboo. And over here, it's kind of the opposite, but there's always going to be, exceptions to the rule. But I wonder, is the promulgation of violence and violent media, does that beget violence in the society? That's another interesting idea of Orwell's, and you could say either yes or no if you wanted to look at that issue. Number 7, I have sexual repression, Orwell versus Huxley. You'll recall some very provocative ideas on the part of Orwell regarding sexuality, how he sees sexuality as an act of political rebellion, and how the character Winston seems to laud the promiscuity of his girlfriend. And that's a very weird thing. And then you see later Julia talking about how attacking or repressing the sex instinct probably leads to more violent tendencies, and people get all angry and stuff. And you have to remember the time in which Orwell was writing this was a much more morally conservative in a way, I suppose. There was a lot more sexual repression. The whole liberation movement had not really yet occurred. So I think he was just kind of theorizing that, like, why would it be so suppressed? Oh, it must be that this leads to more anger or more violence or whatever. But then there's Mr. Aldous Huxley. And if I were to teach my perfect 1101 class, I would make you read both 1984 and Brave New World in conversation with one another. But Huxley thought the other way. Huxley thought that they would indulge sexuality. In fact, they wouldn't just indulge sexuality, they would indulge every sort of hedonistic desire that you had, be it related to food or drink or sexuality or whatever. And he kind of based this on the old Roman adage, give them bread and circuses and they'll never revolt. The idea was that it's a means of maintaining complacency. And it's very interesting how you have these two dystopian authors, one of them suggesting that repression is the means of executing control, and the other one suggesting that indulgence is the means of executing control. And then you look at our own reality and you see, depending on where you're looking, you can kind of see the repression and you can kind of see the indulgence, and you see the negative effects of both. So that may be some area that you want to look into if you're brave. Number 8, I just have enhanced interrogation techniques. There is the issue of torture, right, in the final. And again, not a very fun topic to talk about as a professor, but in the end of the novel, the third book, Winston endures a lot of torture at the hands of O'Brien and others. And so that kind of brings open the question of, like, is this something that we want to have in our own society? And bringing it back to, I'm a 90s kid. I saw 9/11 happen on the TV, and I saw the society change kind of overnight, and one of the things that changed was the enhanced interrogation techniques and things like waterboarding and things like that were being used to extract information from people who were suspected in terror plots and things like that. And it was a big discussion, whether or not the ends justify the means. If you're dealing with someone who may have information related to some kind of plot or something, shouldn't you be able to use whatever means you have available to you to get that information out of them? And there would be all these hypotheticals about what if there was a nuke in Manhattan and you had the guy that knew it and all this other stuff. But the issue with that is that people under duress and coercion of pain and physical force will tend to say anything to make it stop, including information that is incorrect. And if you make a military decision based on incorrect information, well, that can cost people's lives. So that's another issue of interesting note, how our government sees, and that's another example, by the way, of a doublespeak terminology, right? Enhanced interrogation technique. Okay. So number 9 is groupthink, collectivism versus individualism, towing the party line, and then I have orthodoxy is unconsciousness. So groupthink is an interesting idea. It's the idea that we tend to lose our wits when we get in groups and when groups start acting out. This is why you get riots and things like that. And if a riot happens, you'll often hear people who knew whoever X and Y was involved in the riot, and they'll say, "Well, I never thought that so and so would do that." Well, it's because being in the group changes our psychology. It affects it strangely. And we see this in Orwell's novel in the 2 Minutes Hate. Even though Winston on the inside is thinking, I don't believe in any of this. This is all manufactured. This is all fake. He still goes through the motions of screaming at the TV and throwing his shoe. And I don't know who throws the shoe. I can't remember. I think maybe it's Julia, jumping up and down and gnashing his teeth. It's like he can't control himself because he's in that group, and the group is taking away his individual thought and his ability to rebel or to act in the way that he wants to act. Right. So it's a very interesting thing to think about. How does groupthink affect our society? How does it affect also, if you think about social media and the reality of the echo chamber, right? On social media, if you don't like somebody, you can just block them. Well, if you block everyone that disagrees with you, you get into an echo chamber. And that means that the only people whose ideas you are exposed to are those who already lean in the direction that you're leaning. So then the groupthink takes over, and the sort of radicalizing happens, and it can be a very precarious problem. So that might be an interesting way to think. And also, as a professor that teaches this novel, I deal with students who are very often living in two separate realities. And I think this has to do with towing the party line. I think you're getting into what O'Brien says in the final book, where he starts talking about how the party dictates what reality is, right? And whatever the party says, that's what's true. And then you see this play out in students. They come in and they have certain beliefs. Where did they get those beliefs? Whatever political orthodoxy that they subscribe to already is where they come from. And so it's try to imagine yourself in my position, mitigating between people living in literally different worlds and different environments of information, and what kind of consequences that can have on the society as a whole. Number 10 is controlled opposition or scapegoating. I don't know how much of this you'd be able to really find. I mean, scapegoating, obviously, we know Hitler and the Jews and the Final Solution, but that's pre-Orwell, right? In the modern time, I do think that we kind of have boogeymen, which are used to galvanize support for certain things. And so that may be something you want to think about. Like, how do politicians and government entities, how do they scapegoat? How do they use boogeymen? How do they use the supposed enemy or opposition to their advantage, right? So when I was a kid, and this is just based on my memory, which is fallible at best and subjective, but I can recall, every time it seemed like there was going to be a lull in the support for the war effort, Osama bin Laden would release a new tape. I'm not suggesting that the tapes were not authentic or anything like that, but it was always interesting that the all eyes would shift to public enemy number one, and then the sort of the fervor for justice would be rekindled. So that's an interesting idea. There's always the implication that Orwell gives that Emmanuel Goldstein is not even a real person. He's a creation of the party. He's controlled opposition. He's there to scare people into thinking that there's a boogeyman, and he's there to get heretics to out themselves, which is basically what Winston and Julia do in all of their infinite wisdom when they go to O'Brien's apartment. Okay, so those are just like some general trends. And again, if you've got something else on your radar, you go for it. Don't let me spoon feed you this stuff. But I do know that a lot of you maybe don't have quite the perception of this that you would need to write the essay. So just wanted to give you a couple of breadcrumbs, point you in certain directions. Again, it is not my goal to get you to think anyway, any way, a certain way. I don't want to influence your perspective. I just want to give you things to think about. Beyond Orwell. So there are some things that I think Orwell got wrong, and it's interesting because not necessarily even wrong, but that maybe the trends of what he was thinking about were correct, but he didn't really anticipate how bad it would be or how extreme it would be. So, and I remember I got this idea from watching an interview with Edward Snowden, where at the end of the interview, he says, we should not limit ourselves to the confines of Orwell's imagination. And I think that's really interesting because Orwell's imagination was very limited. I mean, how would you predict in 1948 or whatever it was, on your deathbed dying of tuberculosis, how would you predict the internet? You wouldn't be able to, right? So the telescreen is the best we get, right? It had TVs at the time. It's kind of the apex of technology. So he put some bells and whistles on the TV, and that's how he thought it would play out. But if you look at today, it's worse. It's worse than just TVs on the wall that watch you. You got the internet. You got all this interconnectivity. You got people that can link up across different parts of the world that have totally different ideologies, and just all of this weird stuff that I don't think he ever could have anticipated that is related to the internet specifically. Number two is artificial intelligence. The sci-fi genre was kind of picking up steam during Orwell's time, but he really wasn't much of a part of that. And so, the idea of AI or like creating intelligent or quasi-intelligent or seemingly intelligent beings, or even what the AI implies and how it sublets a lot of the thinking. I am concerned as a professor that the reliance on AI will cause the critical thinking skills of students to depreciate. In fact, I'm already seeing that, I think, on some level. So that's another Orwellian theme that, thematically, it fits with the dystopia, it fits with the trend, but it's not really accurate in terms of what the novel says. He didn't really predict that effectively. Number three is algorithmic media or profiles. In my lifetime, it's gone from being, you see whatever the news networks show you on the nighttime news, to you see whatever the social media companies feed you, and they feed you stuff based on what you've already clicked on and what you already like. And it's a customized media diet. And that's a problem too. There's not an objective media consumption. It's customized. So people who lean a certain way or who like a certain thing, they see more of the thing that they lean towards or like and less of the things that they don't. And so they get further into that notion that that's the reality, when it's actually only a piece of the reality, and it's disproportionately fed to them by the algorithm. Also, the profiles that the companies and stuff build on you. They know your search history, they know what you do, they know who you talk to, they know what you like. You got ads that are customized to you, and this is kind of sold to you under the pretext that this is to your benefit, because you'll get more stuff that you actually like. But then remember too how the party uses the knowledge of the individual and their likes and wants and needs against them. When Winston goes in there to room 101, what's there? A rat. How did they know? They were watching him the whole time, and they built we see it. We see a rat came out in the room, and he freaked out. He must be afraid of rats, right? Well, so that opens up a bigger question. If the powers that be know everything about you, about who you are and what you like and what you don't like and all that stuff, doesn't that give them some kind of advantage? Doesn't that enable some form of manipulation? Or couldn't it, theoretically? Another thing, too, is that when you have these things, you kind of have to think about the potential for abuse. Not just how are they being used now, but how could they be used under the wrong circumstances. Number five is just technological advancements generally. I think that there are lots of things that exist now that he just didn't have the capacity to predict because nothing like it existed at the time, and there was no clue that it was going to happen. Right, so you could use really lots of different types of technology. I do think the speak right is interesting because it's kind of like how we dictate to phones and stuff now. But generally speaking, Orwell's technology is pretty quaint compared to what we have today. So areas that I think, and there aren't many, and that I can think of off the top of my head, but I'm sure you may be able to see more things that he really got wrong. Number one is this is all really everything I've said to you really primarily concerns with the United States. The essay doesn't say you have to write about the United States. You can write about other countries and where this enforced scarcity may exist. But generally speaking, the United States doesn't try to enforce scarcity upon its citizens. I think it goes the other way with it because we have the highest standard of living of any country. We have the highest access to food, medicine, and water in general than a lot of other countries. And so I think that actually, rather than deliberately create scarcity, I think that it's the opposite. I think that our needs our base needs are met uh, in many cases to a great extent, and this is designed to keep us complacent. The thing about scarcity, yeah, scarcity can be used to control people, but it also embitters them, right? You'll think back to a modest proposal, and when I prefaced that discussion, we talked a little bit about the history of England and Ireland and the IRA and the deep resentment that exists there. Well, that has to do with enforced scarcity in a way, the potato famine and the extortion of the agrarian mechanisms of Ireland for the gain of England, and that created a lot of resentment, and it created a political conflict that was one of the most severe in the world up until my lifetime. So, is that really the purpose to make things scarce? Because don't desperate people get angry and don't they become dangerous? I think there's a lot that could be unpacked there. But it is something that I generally think about when I think about was Orwell right or not. I at least with regards to our own country, it seems as though scarcity ain't it. Number three, I already mentioned this: the internet, interconnectivity. To take it further than just the internet itself, the interconnectivity of people kind of goes against Orwell's idea that everyone will be isolated and shut off. Rather than being isolated and shut off, you can make friends that you've never met before just by logging online. And so I think that in that way, the interconnectivity, the interpersonal relationship aspect that the internet implies is sort of anti-Orwellian. Orwell thought you'd be completely closed off. Now, the other side of that coin is that a lot of people really are closed off. A lot of people, the internet enables them to just check out into a fantasy land and not have to actually live their lives. And so I think this is one of those things that can go both ways, but it is something to think about. And then number four, I just have conversion to prevent martyrs. I don't see a lot of concern in our own society with the creation of martyrs. In Orwell's story, in order to deal with the dissenter, the party would convert them before killing them, because if they killed them before converting them, they would create a martyr. And remember, a martyr is somebody who can rally a cause beyond death. They become a symbol. And becoming a symbol is a problem because you can't kill a symbol. The symbol is transpersonal, and it creates future problems. So I don't know. It seems like we have quite a few martyrs in our own society, and it doesn't seem like the status quo is terribly concerned with creating them or not creating them. So that's another area that I wonder. Again, these are not the only areas for study. There are plenty of things that you can look into. I also want to specify again, I do not mean to force feed you any conclusion about the state of American politics or the society in which we live. I just want to get you to think about how the novel might apply to the real world or not apply in this case. One of the things I do also want to say is that you do want to pick, does it apply or not apply in the essay? Don't say it does and doesn't, because I know that's true. I just showed you that that was true. But for the sake of consistency, definitely do that. Looking back, I think I skimmed over this issue of deep fakes. So I do want to touch on that because that's beyond Orwell too. That's something he couldn't really. We live in a world now where using AI and computer technology and all sorts of stuff, you can pretty much create videos of whatever. You create videos of famous people robbing gas stations, and how would you necessarily know that that video is fake? For some people, it can be very hard to tell. Maybe you've trained your eye to look for the AI or to see the telltale signs, but a lot of times people, it seems like they really can't tell. And so I think that becomes a problem too, because you're living in a world where you see a video online, it shows something crazy happening. How do you know that video is real? How do you corroborate that video? Right? And again, that's beyond Orwell's imagination. He thought that propagandists would make up stories. He didn't think that computers would make up realities. That's very different. And so think about that. Think about all this stuff. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm not trying to get you overwhelmed, but I am trying to make you understand why it is I teach this novel. I do think it's extremely applicable to the world in which you're living in an almost frightening way. And I think that understanding Orwell and his positions is a good way to help you navigate the world you're living in now. Mainly, you really want to corroborate evidence. You really want to make sure you know what's true and what's real, and not to fall for any of these pitfalls of Orwellian tactics or manipulation or propaganda. Right? You want to keep your head about you, and I think this novel is one of the ways to show how to do that. So I will stop talking. I've talked enough. If you have any questions for me regarding this, don't hesitate to reach out by email. If not, have a wonderful life, weekend, whatever it is, and I will see you next time.